July 10, 1943. The war in North Africa had ended, and the first convoys of captured German soldiers rolled across the southern United States under the cover of night. A line of trucks, headlights cutting through the dark, carried men who had once sworn allegiance to Hitler's Reich. Their boots were gone, their uniforms stripped, their eyes sunken with exhaustion. These were not immigrants seeking a new life. They were prisoners, enemies of America, shipped across the ocean to a land they had been told was weak, decadent, and already collapsing under its own corruption. But when those trucks stopped and the men stepped onto American soil, the shock was immediate. They had expected brutality, hunger, perhaps even execution. Instead, they found order. They found discipline. And more than anything, they found abundance. The United States had hidden its prisoner of war camps in plain sight, across Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and the Carolinas. Guarded by boys barely old enough to shave, the camps became unlikely stages for a psychological battle that no bullet could win. From the very first day, the contradictions gnawed at the prisoners. Their meals, meat, bread, vegetables, were larger than what their families back in Germany had eaten in years. They were issued clean clothes, medical care, and books banned in the Reich. They saw warehouses stacked with supplies, fields overflowing with crops, towns lit brightly at night without fear of bombers overhead. The propaganda they had swallowed, that America was weak, fractured, and dying, crumbled with every bite of food, every light bulb burning past midnight. This was not decadence. This was strength. A strength so vast that even captivity here seemed better than freedom back home. And so began a hidden front in the Second World War, not fought with tanks or planes, but with bread, electricity, and the quiet, devastating weight of truth. The train stopped. Norfolk Naval Base, August 1943. And for the first time, thousands of German prisoners stepped foot on American soil. But this was not just disembarkation, it was revelation, an unveiling of a power so vast that even the most indoctrinated among them began to feel the cracks in their loyalty. Picture what they saw: a single port sprawling across 4,300 acres, docks stretching for miles, alive with cranes lifting and lowering steel cargo with mechanical ease. Ships, dozens upon dozens of them, loading and unloading simultaneously. In one day, this single port moved more tonnage than Hamburg could process in an entire week. Think about that. One American harbour operating casually, outproducing Germany's most prized industrial port. Among the prisoners was Friedrich Radke, a decorated veteran with the Iron Cross pinned to his chest. He had faced tanks in France, artillery in Africa, and had survived battles where death hung so close it could be smelled on the sand. Yet here, at Norfolk, he felt something deeper than fear: inevitability. He wrote later, "I realized our Reich was not fighting men. We were fighting factories, and we had already lost." The shock deepened as the prisoners marched past parking lots filled not with military vehicles, but civilian cars. Hundreds of them. To the German mind, trained under Goebbels' propaganda, this was impossible. In Germany, private automobiles were the privilege of the few, the wealthy, the party elite. The Volkswagen, the so-called people's car, had been little more than a dream, with fewer than 1,000 ever reaching civilian hands. Yet here in America, dock workers, ordinary labourers, drove to work in their own cars. To men who had marched across Europe in cattle cars, who had fought and bled for a regime that promised a people's utopia, this sight was more humiliating than chains. And then came the threat. Inns, not boxcars, not the cramped 40-and-8 wagons that had carried German soldiers across the continent. No, these were Pullman coaches, built for comfort. Padded seats, polished wood, white linen dining cars. One prisoner wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not captives." The guards even apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly. Air conditioning. A luxury the prisoners had believed existed only in Hitler's personal train, and now it was given freely, without arrogance, to the enemy. Understand this. Propaganda collapses not when a bullet pierces the body, but when truth pierces the mind. That day in Norfolk, thousands of soldiers discovered a truth their Reich had hidden from them. They were not superior. They were not destined to win. They were watching the industrial titan of the modern age awaken before their very eyes. The Liberty ships that carried the German prisoners across the Atlantic were not just transport vessels, they were weapons of psychological war. Each ship was proof that America could bend time itself, collapsing months of work into days. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes, an industrial miracle that would have been dismissed as fantasy in the Reich. At the peak of production, America launched 3 of these steel giants every single day. To the prisoners, the ship beneath their feet was not just a vessel. It was a floating reminder that their nation could never match this rhythm. But the true demolition of pride came in the mess halls and garbage bins. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a secret record, his words etched with disbelief. He wrote, "The Americans threw away more food in 1 day than our company received in a week. Half-eaten steaks scraped into metal barrels. Entire loaves of bread discarded because they had grown slightly stale. Gallons of milk poured overboard. The sailors did this without arrogance, without intent to mock, because to them it meant nothing. Supply was limitless. Abundance was casual." Understand what that meant to the German mind. These were men hardened by desert warfare, who had rationed every crumb, who had fought over mouldy bread crusts in Tunisia. They had lived in a world where scarcity was normal, where sacrifice was demanded as proof of loyalty. And now, in the belly of an American ship, they witnessed waste on a scale so casual it became monstrous. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Steuben, a man from one of Prussia's oldest military families, described the moment his pride began to fracture. He stood on deck as the ship approached the American coast, watching the radar antenna sweep silently above the bridge. Radar on a cargo ship. Technology the He had sworn was its own secret advantage was here, standard equipment as common as a lifeboat. Steuben later wrote, "I knew then we were finished. If this was their ordinary, our extraordinary was meaningless." The Atlantic crossing was more than a voyage. It was an indoctrination into a new reality, a forced unmasking. Every meal, every casual conversation with American guards, every detail of the ship whispered the same truth. America was not merely another nation. It was an empire of industry, a civilization that could outproduce, outfeed and outlast anything Germany could dream of. By the time those ships reached Virginia, the first stage of ideological collapse was complete. The men no longer asked if Germany could win. They began to wonder how long the Reich could even survive. August 2, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The Liberty ships groaned as they docked, and the German prisoners, tens of thousands of them, filed to the railings. What they saw was not a port. It was a vision of the impossible. Stretching before them was a sprawl of steel and motion so vast it defied their senses. Docks as far as the eye could see. Cranes that moved as if powered by gods, swinging steel containers with effortless precision. Lines of ships, 40, 50, 60 at a time, loading, unloading, refueling. One prisoner, Johann Weber, who had worked in the Ruhr before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships docked simultaneously. He whispered, "This one port moves more in a single day than Hamburg in a week." That sentence carried the weight of defeat. The men had been told America was weak, divided, collapsing under corruption. But this was no weakness. This was a juggernaut. The sheer acreage of the base dwarfed even Germany's grandest naval stations. The air stank not of coal smoke and horses, but of electricity and oil. Machines replaced men. Efficiency replaced exhaustion. Then came the march. The prisoners, still stunned, were herded into columns and marched past the automobiles. Hundreds of them. Not military trucks, but personal cars. Civilian cars, shiny, plentiful, casual. A dock worker, hands black with grease, climbed into his own automobile and drove away. To German eyes, this was sorcery. In the Reich, cars were symbols of privilege. The average German could only dream of owning one, while Goebbels promised them a Volkswagen that almost no one ever received. Yet here, the lowest dock labourer owned what their middle class could not. The illusion of superiority was bleeding out of them with every step. And then, the final insult, came the trains. Not the cramped cattle wagons of Europe, not the 48 cars that had carried their own armies across France. These were Pullman coaches, polished wood interiors, padded seats that folded into beds, dining cars dressed in white linen, observation decks with panoramic glass. The guards, half apologetic, explained that the air conditioning was broken. Air conditioning. To German soldiers who had lived through years of shortages, who had bled under the Mediterranean sun, who had been told this was a luxury reserved for the Führer himself, this casual inconvenience crushed them more than any bullet. Understand this: the shattering of a worldview rarely comes in a single moment of violence. It comes drip by drip, revelation by revelation, until the lies can no longer hold. In Norfolk, the lies of Nazi propaganda dissolved under the blinding light of American reality. The prisoners boarded the trains in silence. They were no longer captives of war. They were captives of truth. The train lurched forward, steel wheels hammering rhythm into the rails. Norfolk disappeared behind them, and the German prisoners pressed their faces to the windows. What unfolded before their eyes was not a landscape. It was an assault on everything they had been taught to believe. Night fell, but the darkness never came. Town after town, city after city glowed with light. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro. Each one illuminated like a festival, every street lit, every house glowing, every shop alive with signs and electric windows. The Germans had lived under blackout orders since 1940, stumbling through cities cloaked in fear of bombers. Entire districts in Berlin, Hamburg, Munich smothered in shadows. And yet here, in towns they had never heard of, in places considered provincial by American standards, electricity flowed without hesitation, without fear, without limit. Obergefreiter Hans Mührer, whose father was a loyal Nazi Party block leader in Hamburg, stared into the glowing towns and muttered to himself, "Every single one has more light than all of Hamburg combined." He didn't believe it at first. He accused the American Guard of lying. The Guard simply shrugged and said, "You'll see more tomorrow." And they did. At Roanoke, the train stopped for coal and water. The prisoners watched workers resupply the locomotive in 30 minutes, an operation that would have taken hours in Germany. Coal loaders moved automatically. Water pumps powered by electricity filled tanks without manual labor. Lubrication systems hissed as machines did in seconds what men with wrenches would need hours to accomplish back home. But what disturbed the prisoners most was not the machinery. It was the men. Ordinary American railway workers wearing leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finis, head without care. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles, tossed them into bins without thought. Waste everywhere. Waste on a scale that felt obscene. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, an engineer before the war, began calculating as he watched the railway yard burn with light. His conclusion was devastating. He estimated that one American rail yard used more electricity in a single hour than his entire Berlin district consumed in a full day. He wrote later, "The waste was magnificent. They left lights burning in empty buildings, fans turned in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource." And in that moment, every man on that train began to understand. The war Germany had started was already unwinnable. For how could a nation living in scarcity defeat a nation drowning in abundance? The train thundered westward, carving through Tennessee and Kentucky, and the Germans could no longer cling to denial. What unfolded outside their windows was not countryside, it was empire. Factories rose like cathedrals of steel, endless brick and smoke and power stretching to the horizon. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee dominated the riverbank, its furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of electricity, more than the entire city of Munich. To German eyes, accustomed to rationed energy and shortages that strangled their industries, this was not a plant. It was an altar to a god they had never believed in: abundance. Near Louisville, the prisoners stared at the Rubbertown complex, synthetic rubber plants that had sprung from empty fields in less than 2 years. 4 massive facilities, each feeding thousands of workers, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany had invented synthetic rubber, but even at its peak, the Reich had barely managed 120,000 tons. Here, America had multiplied it sixfold with casual ease. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, pressed his notebook to the glass as the factories slid past. He whispered to his companions, "Each one is larger than anything we ever built, and there are 4 of them, just here." Later, in a post-war interview, he admitted the truth that froze him in that moment. They had industrialized miracles. We could not compete. But the most devastating blow came as the train slowed outside Detroit. From miles away, the prisoners saw it, Ford's Willow Run plant, a factory so vast it swallowed the horizon. Within its 2.5 million square feet, 42,000 workers assembled B-24 Liberator bombers, not by the month, not by the week, but one every 63 minutes. The Germans gawked as hangar doors opened, revealing aircraft in every stage of construction, fuselages gleaming under floodlights, wings lifted by cranes, engines lined in rows like metal soldiers awaiting command. To men who had been told that American planes were cheap, fragile, inferior, the sight was unbearable. These bombers were not inferior. They were built with precision. They were built fast. They were built endlessly. Unteroffizier Helmut Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot captured in Tunisia, counted 17 B-24s in his line of sight. His face pale, he muttered, "We were told they could not build fast enough, that their planes would fall apart. But here, they build war like we build words." Understand this, the train was no longer transport, it was indoctrination. Every mile deeper into America stripped another layer of Nazi illusion away. And for the first time, the prisoners began to feel not just doubt, but dread. For they were seeing the truth with their own eyes. Germany had never been the master of industry. America was. And America was only beginning to move at full speed. The train roared across the Mississippi at St. Louis, and the Germans pressed to the windows, waiting for the skyline of another city. But what they saw first was not concrete. It was food. Endless lines of grain elevators loomed over the riverbanks, towering silos stretching skyward like monuments. Barges moved beneath them, each filled to bursting with golden kernels that glowed in the late sun. Cranes dipped and rose, pouring grain by the ton into steel bellies bound for markets and armies thousands of miles away. For men who had fought through North Africa, where every crumb of bread was contested, this was incomprehensible. Germany's soldiers lived on rations that grew thinner each year, brown bread stretched with sawdust, watery soups that offered calories but no strength. In Tunisia, some divisions had survived on little more than tins of horse meat. Yet here, in one river crossing, the prisoners saw more food in motion than Germany could feed its armies in a month. And it did not stop with grain. As the train rolled into Missouri, the windows became a moving cinema of abundance. Mile after mile of cornfields, so thick and green they looked painted. Fields of soybeans, unheard of by most Germans, stretched until they blurred with the horizon. Cattle by the thousands grazed in fenced pastures, each animal heavier and fatter than the scrawny cows left behind in Europe. Unteroffizier Franz Reinhardt, raised on a Bavarian farm, shook his head in disbelief. "They could feed all of Europe with this," he muttered. A guard, overhearing, corrected him. "This? No, this is just Missouri." The train clattered into St. Louis itself, where slaughterhouses and packing plants filled the air with the thick, sweet smell of blood and meat. Conveyor belts moved sides of beef faster than German soldiers could march. Refrigerated cars stood waiting, ready to send pork and beef assault across the nation without fear of spoilage. Cold storage, another luxury Germany had lost to shortages of electricity and fuel. The prisoners stood silent as the train paused. They watched American workers, ordinary laborers, eat their lunches on crates, thick sandwiches, bottles of milk, slices of pie. One man finished half his meal and tossed the rest aside. To the Germans, that waste was obscene, almost blasphemous. But to the Americans, it was nothing, because there was always more. In that moment, the German soldiers felt something they had not known since their capture: hunger. But this hunger was not for bread. It was for the illusion of strength they had lost. For the first time, they began to understand why they had been sent across the ocean alive. They were not just prisoners. They were witnesses. Witnesses to the Reich's greatest lie, that Germany was a master nation. Here, on the banks of the Mississippi, they saw the truth. Germany had gambled everything on scarcity. America was built on surplus, and surplus was victory. The train screeched to a halt in the heart of America. Fences stretched across the horizon, watchtowers casting long shadows in the sun. The Germans braced themselves. They had been warned by Nazi propaganda that American captivity meant humiliation, starvation, torture. They expected cruelty. They expected vengeance. They expected death in slow motion. But the gates opened, and none of it came. Inside the camps, the prisoners blinked at what they saw. Rows of wooden barracks, clean and orderly. Cots lined with mattresses and real blankets. Mess halls serving hot meals 3 times a day, meals that often contained more meat, bread and vegetables than German soldiers at the front had seen in months. Some camps even served coffee with real sugar, not the burned rye substitute they had grown used to in the Reich. Gefreiter Karl Hennig wrote in his diary, "I had not tasted real coffee since 1941. Here it was handed to me by a man who smiled. I wanted to spit in it, to refuse it, to show my loyalty, but I drank, and I wept." The shock deepened as they explored further. Libraries stocked with German books, Goethe, Schiller, even Goethe's Faust. Sports fields where they were encouraged to play football, volleyball, even theatre stages where they could put on plays. Red Cross parcels delivered regularly, each one filled with chocolates, cigarettes, canned meats, even soap. These were luxuries unimaginable in Germany by 1943. And then, the ultimate insult, money. Prisoners were paid small wages for their labour, not in worthless Reichsmarks, but in camp scrip that could be exchanged for candy, writing paper, or even musical instruments. The guards were not brutes, but ordinary men, often younger than the prisoners themselves, polite yet firm. They enforced rules, but rarely humiliated. Some even joked with the Germans, offered them cigarettes, asked them about their homes. The propaganda had promised monsters. Instead, they found neighbours. For officers, the blow was even deeper. By international law, they were not required to work. Instead, they were given lectures, educational courses, even the option to study English, mathematics, or science. It was not punishment, it was opportunity. And in the long nights, many of them wondered, was this not weakness on America's part, but a terrifying kind of strength? Lieutenant Friedrich Kappel, captured at El Alamein, confessed years later, "It was there in that camp, with a book in my hands and meat in my stomach, that I realized the Reich was not the future. It was already the past. America did not conquer us with bullets. It conquered us with dignity." The camps were cages, yes, but they were also mirrors. Mirrors that showed the Germans not only their defeat, but their irrelevance. For here, in a land that treated prisoners better than Germany treated its own civilians, the lie of Aryan superiority collapsed forever. By late 1943, the Germans were no longer confined to the barbed wire. Trucks rolled them out of the camps each morning, guarded yet strangely unshackled, into the beating heart of American life. Their destination, the fields, the factories, the farms that fed the war machine. And what they saw there broke them more than any battlefield ever could. In the Midwest, prisoners bent their backs in cornfields, harvesting row after row under a sun that scorched but never starved. At first, they resisted. Many pretended to work slowly, believing sabotage was their last weapon. But then they noticed something strange. The farmers did not curse them or strike them. Instead, they offered water, food, even shade. One Iowa farmer shared his lunch, thick sandwiches stacked with ham and cheese, slices of apple pie wrapped in wax paper. A prisoner later wrote, "It was more than my mother could have served at Christmas in '42, and this was just a midday meal given without thought." In Texas, others were sent to cotton fields. They marveled at the endless acres, the machines that plucked and ginned faster than dozens of men could manage. In Germany, cotton had vanished by 1940, reserved for uniforms of the Wehrmacht elite. Here it was piled high in warehouses, so plentiful that even prisoners' work shirts were made of it. Factories stunned them even more. In Minnesota, prisoners helped load lumber mills that operated day and night, steam hissing as saws cut with machine precision. The guards explained casually that America had enough wood to rebuild every German city twice over. In Kansas, POWs hauled wheat into elevators so vast that some mistook them for military fortifications. And everywhere, the waste. Workers tossing aside broken tools only to fetch new ones. Farmers discarding bruised fruit that German children would have fought over. One prisoner, Otto Brandt, whispered as he loaded a wagon of surplus grain. "If Berlin had this in 1942, no one would have gone hungry. We are starving while they are drowning." But perhaps the deepest wound came not from abundance, but from freedom. After work, the prisoners were sometimes allowed to walk into small towns under guard. They saw American civilians, women in bright dresses, children clutching ice creams, men with pockets full of cigarettes, living as if there was no war at all. Shops stocked with radios, shoes, coats, even chocolate, while in Germany people stood in lines for hours just to buy a single egg. Lieutenant Dieter Kruger later confessed, "We had been told America was decadent, weak, corrupt, but the people were strong. They lived better in wartime than we did in peace. That day I stopped believing." The Americans had not needed to break their bodies. They broke their faith. And that was a wound that could never be healed. The barbed wire did not only hold men, it held ideologies, festering and colliding. By 1944, the camps had split into two worlds, the hardliners, still loyal to Hitler, and the doubters, shaken by what they had seen of America. The loyalists called themselves Die Schwarzen, the blacks. They wore improvised armbands, painted swastikas on barrack walls, and enforced Nazi discipline with fists and knives. To them, surrender was temporary, but the Reich eternal. They whispered that America's abundance was an illusion, that soon V-weapons would rain on London, that the Führer had secret armies waiting to turn the tide. Their mission was to preserve faith, no matter the cost. But the doubters, the silent majority, had seen too much. They had seen cars for dock workers, meat for farmers, books in prison libraries, electricity pouring endlessly into empty buildings. Their loyalty had cracked under the weight of American plenty. And in the camps, they began to talk. Quietly at first, then more boldly. They questioned propaganda, they mocked Goebbels' speeches, they whispered the unthinkable. Perhaps we were wrong. The blacks did not forgive. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, Unteroffizier Johannes Kunze, a prisoner who dared to praise American food and criticize Hitler, was dragged into a barrack one November night. His fellow Germans beat him, strangled him with a rope, and left his body in the latrine. They called it justice. The Americans called it murder. Across the camps, fear spread. Doubters began to sleep with knives under their pillows or to seek protection from guards. American officers realized that within their barbed wire kingdoms, the war had not ended. It had simply moved indoors. The irony was brutal. The Nazis, who claimed to fight for the honor of the German people, were now killing Germans for the crime of honesty. Each murder only widened the cracks. Men who, once marched proudly under the swastika, now looked at it with suspicion, even hatred. For what kind of future demanded that brothers strangle each other in the night? Lieutenant Ernst Vollmer later recalled, "I feared my guards less than my comrades. The Americans treated us like men. Our own treated us like traitors." The camps had become microcosms of the Reich itself, paranoid, divided, cannibalizing its own strength. And in those shadows, under watchtowers and floodlights, the last illusion of Nazi unity began to rot. By 1944, American officials understood something crucial. These men were not just prisoners. They were raw clay, malleable, fractured and dangerous to the Reich itself. And so the camps shifted. They became more than places of confinement. They became laboratories of re-education. It began subtly. German-language newspapers circulated in the camps, at first neutral, reporting sports scores and farm prices. But slowly, stories appeared about the war's progress. Articles exposing Nazi lies, accounts of atrocities in occupied Europe, photographs of German cities in ruins, firebombed by the very Luftwaffe propaganda had sworn was invincible. Then came the lectures. University professors, many of them German émigrés who had fled Hitler, stood before rooms of captured officers and spoke in the tongue of Goethe. They did not shout, they did not condemn, they simply explained how democracy functioned, how industrial abundance was possible, how free men could achieve more than slaves of ideology. Some prisoners resisted, scoffing at what they called Amerikanische tricks, but others listened. They remembered the lights burning in small towns, the endless trains, the food piled higher than hunger itself. They began to ask questions, not aloud, not in front of the blacks, but in whispers. And then came the ultimate weapon, books. The Americans stocked camp libraries with hundreds of volumes in German, poetry, history, philosophy, even Goethe and Schiller. But slipped among them were works banned by the Reich, Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, even Marx. Prisoners who had grown up in a dictatorship, where knowledge was rationed like bread, suddenly found themselves gorging on forbidden words. Hauptmann Friedrich Adler, once a loyal Nazi, later admitted, "It was in an American camp that I first read Schopenhauer without censorship. I realized then how small my world had been, and Hitler, a man who censors books, fears truth." The Americans did not need to beat ideology out of the prisoners. They let it collapse under the weight of reality. Each class, each book, each conversation was another chisel against the granite of Nazi faith. And slowly, something terrifying for Berlin emerged. Men who no longer believed. Men who, when they returned home, would carry with them the memory of America's lights, its machines, its freedom. Men who would tell others what they had seen. The Reich had sent its sons to war. America had turned them into witnesses. Witnesses who, without lifting a rifle, might someday undo what Hitler had built. The camps were never silent. At night, whispers moved through the barracks like smoke. Whispers of Stalingrad. Whispers of Hamburg burning. Whispers of Normandy. Even with censors watching the mail, news leaked in. American guards spoke too freely. Radios crackled in the distance. Newspapers smuggled between barracks carried headlines that shattered morale. The Reich could not control truth on American soil. By June 1944, the rumors became undeniable. D-Day. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers had stormed the beaches of France. Some prisoners laughed, insisting it was another American lie. But others had seen enough not to doubt. They remembered Norfolk's cranes, Willow Run's bombers, the meat sandwiches in Kansas City. Could Germany possibly resist such a tide? Letters from home arrived, censored but revealing in their emptiness. Mothers who once boasted of Hitler's promises now begged for soap, for coal, for food. Wives wrote of nights in bomb shelters, of neighbours lost in firestorms, of children sleeping under shattered windows. A single line could crush a soldier's spirit. We are still alive, but the city is gone. Inside the camps, factions formed. The diehards, the Schwarz, clung to Hitler like drowning men to driftwood. They threatened, bullied, and even murdered fellow prisoners suspected of defeatism. They carved swastikas into barracks' walls, swore loyalty oaths, and dreamed of a German victory that no longer existed. But another group was growing, the Lagerfriedensbewegung, the peace movement. They were quiet, calculating, and dangerous to the Reich. They read the newspapers in camp libraries, listened to professors in the re-education classes, and began preparing for a Germany after Hitler. They debated democracy, whispered about human rights, and admitted, if only to themselves, that their world had collapsed. One diary entry, hidden beneath a bunk, plank, captured the moment of fracture. We are prisoners, yet freer than those at home. Here, no Gestapo. Here, books the Reich burned. Here, food in abundance while our families starve. I am ashamed. Ashamed of what I believed. Ashamed of what I served. For the Americans, this was victory without a battle. Every newspaper headline, every whispered rumour, every cigarette shared by a guard was another weapon. Propaganda at home had painted America as decadent, weak, dying. But behind the barbed wire, the truth was undeniable. The Reich was losing, and these men were watching its funeral unfold in real time. And so the camps became more than prisons. They became confessionals. Every whisper was a crack in the edifice of Nazi faith. Every rumour another nail in Hitler's coffin. By late 1944, the war inside the wire was no less brutal than the one raging across Europe. But here, rifles and tanks were absent. The weapons were fists, knives carved from scrap metal, and the silence of complicity. The Nazi diehards, the Schwarze, ruled through terror. They enforced Hitler's will even thousands of miles from Berlin, even while dressed in prisoner rags. If a man questioned the Reich, he risked a midnight beating. If a man doubted Hitler, he might not live to see morning roll call. Prisoners whispered about the Kettenhunde, the chain dogs, fanatics who carried out executions ordered by secret camp tribunals. Their victims were labelled traitors, defeatists, or worse, collaborators with the Americans. In reality, they were often simply men who had admitted what others dared not, that Germany was dying. The Americans watched uneasily. The Geneva Convention forbade them from interfering in internal camp discipline, but soon the violence grew too visible to ignore. Bodies were discovered in latrines, men strangled with bedsheets, throats slit with razors. In some camps, the murder rate was so high that military police patrolled at night, not to guard against escapes, but to protect prisoners from each other. The peace movement, the quiet reformers, paid the heaviest price. They were branded Verräter, traitors, by their own countrymen. Yet their courage was extraordinary. In whispered circles, they shared visions of a post-Nazi Germany, a nation reborn from ashes. They risked death not by enemy bullets, but by their fellow prisoners' hands. One American officer later wrote in his report, "We did not need to destroy Nazi faith. They were doing it themselves. Every murder inside the camps revealed the weakness of their creed. It was a death cult eating its own." The most chilling part? Even some of the diehards knew the war was lost. They didn't kill to defend victory. They killed to delay collapse, to silence those who spoke the truth too soon. But truth is resilient. It spread like smoke through the barracks, despite blood on the floors. And every prisoner who witnessed the fanaticism saw what Germany had truly become. A nation devouring its sons to preserve a corpse of ideology. The camps were not just prisons, they were mirrors reflecting the Reich's descent into madness. And the men inside would never forget what they saw. Winter 1944. The news could no longer be contained. The Americans did not need propaganda. Reality itself was enough. Rumors now arrived as fact. Aachen had fallen. Paris had been liberated. The Russians were at the gates of Warsaw. Entire German cities no longer existed, reduced to rubble and ash. For the prisoners, denial became harder than belief. They could no longer cling to the myth of the invincible Reich when letters from home spoke of ruins, hunger, and death. When wives wrote that their children now wore shoes made from cardboard. When mothers begged for news of food shipments that would never come. The Schwarzer grew more desperate. Their threats grew louder, their punishments harsher, but fear was cracking. Men once cowed into silence now whispered back. They had seen too much, eaten too well, read too many forbidden books to still kneel before a corpse of ideology. In some camps, a strange transformation occurred. Prisoners began planning, not for escape, not for sabotage, but for the day they would return to Germany. They debated democracy versus monarchy, federalism versus central power. They asked themselves questions no Nazi had ever allowed. What does freedom mean? What responsibility does a soldier bear for the crimes of his state? One journal entry, written by a former lieutenant of the Afrika Korps, captured the shift. We were sent here as enemies. But America has shown us what Germany never could. Light without blackout curtains. Bread without ration cards. Books without censorship. I do not know if I can ever believe in Hitler again. Perhaps I never truly did. For some, this realization was liberation. For others, it was unbearable. They had built their lives, their pride, their very manhood on the myth of German destiny. To admit it was gone was to admit their lives had been wasted. Those men retreated into rage or silence or fanaticism, but the tide had turned. Every passing month dragged more truth into the open. The Reich was collapsing. Its sons sat in wooden barracks in Texas and Oklahoma eating white bread, reading Goethe, and wondering how a nation of such wealth and power could ever have been called decadent. The Americans did not just imprison German soldiers, they planted seeds. Seeds that would sprout only when Hitler was gone. Seeds that would shape the future of Germany itself. April 1945. The whispers became a roar. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Reich, once promised as a 1,000-year empire, had collapsed in barely 12. The news struck the camps like a thunderclap. Some prisoners cheered openly, dropping the masks they had worn for years. Others collapsed into silence, their eyes vacant, staring at nothing. For the diehards, it was worse than death. They had worshipped a man as a god, and now the god had swallowed poison in a bunker, leaving them orphans of an ideology that no longer existed. One diary recorded the moment. The guards told us the Führer was gone. I laughed, then I wept. Not for him, but for us, for the millions dead, for the cities burned, for the lies we swallowed while America built a world we could never match. The Americans watched carefully. They knew that a man stripped of faith is more dangerous than one who still believes. They offered no celebrations, no jeers, no humiliation. Instead, they gave the prisoners silence. And in that silence, truth echoed louder than bombs. Now came the question no soldier wanted to face. What would happen when the gates opened? Home was no longer a homeland. Cities were ruins. Families were gone. The Reich had left them nothing but shame. Some prisoners clung to the hope of rebuilding. They spoke of returning to farms, to factories, to families who might still be alive. They dreamed of planting wheat instead of graves. But others felt only despair. Without Hitler, without the Reich, who were they? A sergeant from the Afrika Korps scrawled in his notebook, "We return not as heroes, but as witnesses. Witnesses to America's abundance, to Germany's collapse, to the futility of war. Our uniforms are gone, our medals meaningless. We are no longer soldiers. We are men without a country. The irony was brutal. America had captured them with guns, but defeated them with light, bulbs, bread, and books. They had come as warriors. They left as disillusioned survivors, carrying truths they could never unsee. And yet, in that defeat lay a hidden strength. Because those men, stripped of illusions, would one day carry Germany not into another war, but into something it had never known: democracy. But first, they had to walk out of the gates. The day of release did not feel like triumph. It felt like exile. The gates opened, and men who had once marched proudly under the swastika now stepped into a world that no longer existed. Their Reich was ashes. Their cities were skeletons. Their families, if alive, were scattered among ruins. The Americans handed them papers, food rations, and train tickets. No speeches, no banners. Just a quiet dismissal into the wreckage of their homeland. But the men carried something more valuable than any medal they had once worn. They carried memory. They remembered the lights burning in small American towns while Germany drowned in blackout. They remembered the Pullman cars with air conditioning while their own people shivered in rubble. They remembered factories that built bombers faster than Germany could repair a single airfield. They remembered eating meat like bread, reading banned books in camp libraries, hearing professors speak without fear of the Gestapo. And most of all, they remembered the silence. The silence of a free people who did not need to shout loyalty oaths or wear uniforms to prove their worth. In that silence, they had seen a power deeper than steel, the power of a society that trusted its own strength. Back in Germany, they became uneasy prophets. Some spoke of America with awe, others with envy, others with shame. But all carried the same forbidden knowledge. The Reich had never been destined to win. It had been destined to collapse the moment it faced a nation that could outproduce, outfeed, and outthink it. Historians would later note a strange pattern. Many of the men who had been prisoners in America became leaders of post-war Germany. Not in politics, but in industry, education, and community life. They knew what modern power looked like. They had walked its streets, eaten its food, and felt its reach, and they would never again be deceived by promises of demagogues. For the Reich, captivity was supposed to be humiliation. Instead, it was revelation. America had not just captured German soldiers, it had captured their imaginations, and in doing so, destroyed the mythology of Nazi destiny from within. The war ended with bombs, but the true victory came from bread, from books, from electricity flowing endlessly across a continent. These were the weapons that broke the Reich more completely than tanks ever could. And so the German POWs went home not as conquerors, not even as soldiers, but as witnesses. Witnesses to a forbidden truth. That power is not measured only by armies, but by the abundance that sustains them. A truth they were never meant to see, yet one they carried back across the Atlantic forever changed.